going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of JT Sports Live. I'm your host, JT, and we got to talk about the fallout from college football's chaotic week 6 of action. There were tons of upsets. Bama lost to Vanderbilt. You had a temper tantrum thrown by two-time team captain Malachi Moore. Are there culture problems now down there in Tuscaloosa under Kalen DeBoer? We got to talk about it. Vanderbilt, how good are they? Are they still the doormat of the SEC that just so happened to play their best game of the year against the Tide? Or are the Commodores a legitimate threat to possibly pull off a few more upsets this year? USC, Michigan, they fell victim to the upset bug. What's going wrong with them? Miami has once again found the way to escape the hands of defeat. Are they being helped out by the refs? On the NFL side of things, I got to give some key takeaways to the Cowboys win over the Steelers. Is it Jameis Winston time in Cleveland? And let's talk about the brutal reality about the Carolina Panthers and the two major issues that are killing the Buffalo Bills. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in, wherever you're watching, YouTube, X. Do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on post notifications so you don't miss when we go live and drop new content. You can find us on all podcasting platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. The JT Sports Podcast is available. Give us a 5-star review if you enjoy. Follow us on all of our social media platforms. You can find us on Instagram at JT Sports _ and on X at JT Sports __. Shout out to my guy Unruly TV in the chat. Shout out to everybody that's joining live wherever you're watching. Appreciate you for tuning in. And let's dive into it. So Alabama's upset the Vanderbilt, shocked the college football world. And during this loss, you had two-time captain Malachi Moore, who pretty much threw a temper tantrum on the field due to his frustration from his team's performance. He threw his mouthpiece. He ended up kicking the ball when Vanderbilt was trying to nil out the rest of the clock. And this is something that you never expect out of an Alabama team, because Alabama, when you think of this football team, what this program has been so many years under Nick Saban, discipline, not tolerating any BS on the field, and then you get Kalen DeBoer who comes in, who isn't as tough on players as what Nick Saban is. Kalen DeBoer, he's not one of those coaches that's a yeller, a screamer. He's going to cuss out and berate guys on the sidelines like what Nick Saban has done. But it was really surprising to me to see Malachi Moore do what he did. There was a situation where Alabama was trying to sub him out the game and he refused to be taken out. And it's fair to say that if Nick Saban was still the coach, Malachi Moore probably wouldn't have went about things the way that he did against Vandy. Because one thing about Nick Saban, when he tells you to do something, you do it. He ain't want to hear no back talk, no flack. And under Kalen DeBoer, you know, when you got Malachi Moore just wilding out like this, and remind you, this is somebody who probably is the only remaining member from Alabama's 2020 national championship team. So with somebody that has this much experience, that's been with the program for so long, you don't expect this kind of behavior. He was never doing anything like this when Nick Saban was there, but now all of a sudden he's cutting loose against Kalen DeBoer, pretty much running amok. You know, there are some fair questions to be had when it comes to the new era of Alabama football under Kalen DeBoer. He's going about handling certain situations a lot differently than what Nick Saban would. Maybe he's not one of those coaches that's about trying to address in-house issues on the sidelines. Maybe he probably prefers to handle them behind closed doors. Maybe that's when he starts giving it to players. But, you know, is Kalen DeBoer a little bit too soft? I feel like he is, because you got to remember that Kalen DeBoer is a West Coast guy. Guys on the West Coast don't have as many character issues as what some of these players that come from the South do. Guys from the South are a little bit more, you know, nonchalant in terms of how they handle criticism from coaches. You know, a coach could tell them one thing and they go in one ear and outside the other, and they still continue to do their own thing. But guys from the West Coast, they don't tend to be as problematic as these Southern players are. And playing high school football in the South, I understand that there's a lot more ego that these players tend to have. And guys from the West Coast, you know, it's just a different kind of personality that you have to coach with when you're coaching those guys versus these kids that you now are inheriting down in Tuscaloosa. You know, Nick Saban was a strict disciplinarian. Now, he did allow players to make mistakes, but just because he was willing to give certain players second chances didn't mean that he wasn't strict. You know, Nick Saban was often viewed as not being a lot of fun, strictly business. Kalen DeBoer seems to be more as a player-friendly kind of coach where, you know, he's all about trying to be liked by the players. And there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to always be downright hard on certain kids just to get them to play well. You know, you can be a easygoing guy who doesn't really scream a lot, doesn't really give it to the players, and still be a well-coached team. You know, it's different ways that are having a successful football program. Just because Nick Saban won one way at Alabama doesn't mean that Kalen DeBoer has to copy and paste his formula for success. You know, every coach is different. And Kalen DeBoer, when you listen to him talk in his press conference, you know, he's not really somebody that you would think is really a Nick Saban kind of coach. But just because he's a little bit softer on players than what Saban was, doesn't mean that he's not going to work out in Alabama. Kalen DeBoer has won everywhere he's been. NAIA ball. He led his alma mater to 3 national championships. He won at Fresno. He won at Washington. If you win everywhere you go, how can people really question how you run your operation if you've succeeded everywhere? You know, and even though losing to Vanderbilt is one of those unforgivable losses that a school like Alabama should never have, it's just one loss. Kalen DeBoer beat Georgia last week, and everybody was singing his praises. Now, Vandy beats Bama, and all of a sudden, this dude may not be the right fit to replace Nick Saban. It's one game. There's a lot of football left to be played, and this is a chaotic season that we've been seeing so far. You know, there's been tons of upsets. Damn near nearly everybody's going to end up having a shocking loss or two by the time this season concludes. So I believe there are a lot of overreactions to this Alabama loss to Vandy. I know it's bad. I know it's inexcusable. But to start questioning a guy like Kalen DeBoer's ability to coach and build a program, I think is a bit, you know, unnecessary. Because if Alabama was like 1-4 or 1-5, then it would be a fair conversation. But it's still early to be trying to draw conclusions about if Kalen DeBoer is running Alabama football the right way for them to have championship success. He's a great coach. He proved that when Alabama beat Georgia. And although they've been playing some bad football since the second half of that Georgia game, you know, this is still one of the best teams in college football from a talent standpoint. They still got a very good coaching staff. What this Vanderbilt loss was for Kalen DeBoer in Alabama was a wake-up call. It was a reality check that, hey, we need to change some things up. We need to get back to the drawing board and find a way to get ourselves back playing the great football that we was prior to the second half against Georgia. You know, this is one of those wake-up calls that for a coach like Kalen DeBoer, he's going to take it on the chin and he's going to make the necessary adjustments. Just because he isn't screaming at guys on the sidelines doesn't mean that he's not giving them discipline. This is a pretty good coach. He's won everywhere he's been. And I believe that he was the best replacement that Alabama could have possibly gotten for Nick Saban. So I'm not really worried about the whole locker room concerns that people have. I'm not worried about the culture. I think that these are overreactions to a really upsetting loss. Malachi Moore probably wasn't the only player that felt this way. And I'm not excusing his actions. All I'm saying is that you don't have to scream at guys during the games, on the sidelines. There's other ways to handle these kinds of issues. What is Vanderbilt after beating Alabama? Is this just a one-off performance where they played Alabama and that was their Super Bowl and they're going to crash back down to earth? And are we going to see the Vandy team that we saw lose to Georgia State not too long ago? Or is Vanderbilt no longer the doormat of the SEC? I think that at this point now, you got to start viewing Vanderbilt as a quality team in the SEC this season. They got a really good quarterback, and Diego Pavia, a transfer from New Mexico State. You remember when New Mexico State last year went on the road and clocked Auburn and Jordan Hare? Yeah, he was the quarterback that year for that squad. And so far for Vandy, he's been a revelation for this program. Vanderbilt hasn't had good quarterback play in a very long time. And with how well Diego Pavia is playing, he could go down as the most talented quarterback in Commodore's history. Better than Jay Cutler. When you watch Pavia play, I see a quarterback that is always calm. He always knows where to go with the football. He's really accurate. He's completing 67.7% of his passes. Makes great decisions with the football. 8 touchdowns, no interceptions, and he's a really good runner as well. 335 rushing yards, 2 tutties to go along with that. He's a gamer. And right now, I view Diego Pavia as a legitimate NFL prospect at quarterback. I think he's a better NFL prospect than what Quinn Ewers is. With you being able to play this well for Vandy, a school that has normally been pretty dreadful when it comes to football since the beginning of time, you're different. And Diego Pavia is one of those players that when you bring him into your program, he changes everything. If you didn't have this dude at quarterback, you probably wouldn't have any wins this year because Diego Pavia has quietly started to become one of the best kept secrets in college football. And I'm not really surprised that Vanderbilt gave Alabama a close game. It's a large reason why I didn't put it on my best bets because I got a lot of friends who were betting on Alabama to not just win outright, but cover that spread. And I was trying to warn them. I was like, man, I don't know. Even though I was pretty confident Bama was going to win, I wasn't expecting them to lose. I wasn't expecting this game to be a blowout because Vanderbilt, they nearly beat Missouri. They only lost that game in overtime, and they beat Virginia Tech early during the season. So this is a really solid team. They may not be great. They may not be in the conversation to make the playoffs at the end of the year, but this is definitely a team that I can see winning 8, maybe 9 games potentially. They were able to frustrate Jalen Milroe. They shut him down. Yeah, he had a couple of big plays, but against Vandy, Jalen Milroe played probably his worst game of the season. He was scoring 5 touchdowns damn near every single game until he played Vandy, and we saw a little bit of the Jalen Milroe that we seen all last season, being inaccurate with the football at times, having head-scratching decision-making. Vandy has a really good quarterback. They got a really good coaching staff. The OC for New Mexico State that Pavia played for last season, he followed them to Vandy when he took the offensive coordinator gig. And Vanderbilt has made a lot of changes with their football program under Clark Lee. They are renovating their stadium. And despite majority of their home crowd being Alabama fans, you know, they were still able to win that game. The crowd noise didn't affect them. This is a team that is not intimidated by playing against opponents that have more talent than them. You know, unlike the Vanderbilt teams that we've seen in years past, like in games like this, they just will lay an eggshell. They want to show no fight, no resiliency, and even if they got a lead, you were pretty confident that they were going to blow it. But no matter what point of this game you were watching, you always felt that Vanderbilt was going to hold on to this game, even when Alabama was coming back. Anytime it looked like Alabama was about to take control of this game and they were about to run away with it, Vanderbilt would make plays on their own thanks to Drew Pavia or Diego Pavia that would help them maintain control of it. And Vanderbilt is no longer going to be a team that you can look at on your schedule and say, yeah, it's a guaranteed win. There's not a single team this year that Vandy doesn't have a chance at being able to beat. If you can beat a team as good as what Alabama is, there's no unbeatable team on your schedule. Vanderbilt looks like they're having one of those renaissance seasons. And it's not impossible to win that, Vandy. James Franklin, the current head coach of Penn State, he had a lot of success with this program. If you can get a head coach that's a high character guy that can boost the morale of the locker room, get players believing that they can win games like this, you can end up having a really good Vandy squad every once in a while if they have that kind of head coach that's a really good motivator. And Clark Lee seems to be that. So for Vandy, I don't look at them as just them having a one-off performance and they got lucky and they struck lightning in the bottle against Bama. This is an actual good team that is going to have more upsets along the way this season, and nobody really should be surprised anymore if you see a team that's favored a lot against Vandy losing, because this is a program that now has showed that they're not to be taken lightly, and you better take them seriously, because if you have an off game and you're not playing your best football, they're going to end up beating you. No matter if they're playing you in your home territory or if you got to come to their palace and play them, they're good enough to knock off anybody if they're not playing A-plus football. And we saw that with Alabama. They were having turnover issues. They were not playing their best defensively. And you saw Vanderbilt take advantage of that. And that's why Vanderbilt looks to be a quality team moving forward for this season. So USC right now is 1-2 in Big Ten conference play. And is it fair to say that USC can't handle playing Big Ten football? This is a different brand of football that the Trojans are not quite familiar with playing. Or let me rephrase that. You know, USC, they're currently 1-2 right now in Big Ten play, right? And I think that it's fair to say that Big Ten football right now is just too much for the Trojans to handle, because the style of football that you got to play in the Big Ten is way different from the style of football that Lincoln Riley has been accustomed to when he was coaching in the Big 12 at Oklahoma and when USC was playing in the Pac-12 in previous years. When you play in the Big Ten, you got to be tough up front. You got to be physical. You can't be missing tackles on defense. And you got to put more emphasis on running the football. One thing that is really noticeable when you watch USC play in Big Ten matchups this year is that Lincoln Riley is too finesse when it comes to his play calling offensively. He wants to beat you on the perimeter. He wants to beat you with speed and with how well his passing game is. Well, this year, USC is one of the worst teams in the Big Ten when it comes to their commitment running the football. They're second last in the Big Ten Conference when it comes to rush attempts per game. The only team that runs the football less than USC is UCLA. They're 115th in the FBS in rushing attempts per game, and they're 5th in all of college football in passing attempts per game. That shows you that the mentality that Lincoln Riley has isn't winning football in the Big Ten Conference. Look at Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State. Some of the best teams in this conference, they run the football a lot. They have the ability to play complementary football. USC, it's not like their rushing attack is non-existent. They do have a really good stable of running backs, and they have shown that they can run the football if need be. But Lincoln Riley gets too pass happy, and he wants to beat you throwing all these quick passes, these screens, these conservative checkdowns, and it doesn't help USC win these kinds of games that you lost against Minnesota, where it comes down to if you can impose your will up front, if you can have some ability to take time off the clock, can you be able to play bully ball? USC isn't that kind of team. They're one of those West Coast teams that they're flashy with all these nice receivers, all these speed guys, but they don't have strength up front offensively, and that's why Lincoln Riley has the mentality that he has. He knows that USC isn't good enough to hold up front in this conference, which is why he continues to call these plays to take advantage of what he feels these opposing defenses don't have, which is speed on the perimeter to slow down these wide receivers. When I thought about USC coming into this season, I felt like the big advantage that they had on the Big Ten this year was going to be having a guy as dynamic as what Zachariah Branch is, because the Big Ten, as tough as what this conference is, they're not used to seeing the kinds of players that Zachariah Branch is. Really dynamic, super fast, hard to get your hands on, and that's the advantage I thought that USC had. But so far, you haven't really seen too much of that advantage playing a part in some of their games this year, because it gets neutralized. When you're going up against teams that can just eradicate your pass protection, their offensive tackles haven't been good. You have to bench your left tackle in the second half against Michigan because he was getting tortured by Josiah Stewart. It shows you that the kind of game planning that Lincoln Riley has used in the past isn't working now, because he doesn't have any faith in his offensive line to hold up, which is why he's not committed to running the football. If you want to win in the Big Ten, two things you got to be is tough up front, and you got to be able to establish that run game. And even when USC has success running the football against Minnesota, they just will go away from it. And defensively, as good as a defensive coordinator as what D'Anton Lynn is, this defense still is having their fair share of struggles. They're not bad as what they were last year under Alex Grinch. This is a night-and-day defense that the Trojans have. You know, they are bigger. You can see improved defensive line play, and you do see better secondary play with less coverage bust. And USC, their strength on defense is their secondary. Their weakness is that they still aren't that good against the run. Against Michigan on that final drive, what helped Michigan win that game was that you had a big missed tackle that allowed one of their running backs to get them in the red zone and ultimately get the game-winning touchdown. You are giving up 158.6 rushing yards per game. That's 76 in college football. Against Minnesota, they had 193 yards on the ground against you. You gave up 290 on the ground against Michigan. When you're going against these Big Ten schools, no matter if you're going up against a Minnesota, a Rutgers, a Penn State, or Ohio State, they all have a similar identity. They may run their offensive slightly different, but one thing that you can see from every team that actually has a winning record in the Big Ten is that they all have the ability to play smash mouth football. And if you can't play smash mouth football, you can't play grown man football, you don't have the boys in the trenches to hold up playing this kind of physical football, you're not going to have a lot of success. It is the identity of the Big Ten Conference. And when you don't have a certain identity that fits what this conference is, you're going to struggle. In some capacity, watching USC in the Big Ten, you see a giant outcast, because you see a team that doesn't have the personnel that equates to winning football playing in the Big Ten. In the Big Ten, you got to be tough, you got to be physical, and USC, they just don't have the ability to be that. You can't bully a team to death. You can't just maul guys up front because you don't have the players to do so. And I kind of overestimated how difficult the transition to the Big Ten from the Pac-12 was going to be for Lincoln Riley and company. I don't see this being a playoff team anymore. If anything, they have officially been eliminated from playoff contention. Even if you do beat Penn State, you're probably going to have a couple of other losses along the way. You probably are going to be a 4-loss team this year. I don't know if you're going 7-5, but there's a strong chance of it happening. But I still can see you finishing this year going 8-4, maybe 9-3, best case scenario. But so far this year, we've seen that USC, they just aren't really ready for the kind of football that gets played in the Big Ten. Miami is still undefeated. They haven't lost yet, and these past 2 weeks have been incredibly controversial when it comes to how Miami has won. They got a really controversial call against Virginia Tech where it looked like one of the dudes caught the game-winning touchdown, but instead it got ruled an incompletion because one of the defenders for Miami touched the football when he was out of bounds, and when that happens, it automatically gets deemed the incompletion. And then you had a controversial no call against Cal when you were down 35-10 at one point. You come all the way back. You take the lead in the fourth quarter. Cal gets one more possession with the football, and then their quarterback gets absolutely destroyed in what looked like an obvious targeting penalty that ended up resulting in a no call. And you got to wonder, are the refs helping Miami this year? Like, does Vegas want the U to be back? You got to ask these questions because some of these calls, you can make some legitimate arguments and say that these refs are favoring Miami in some of these games, because the thing about Miami is that that despite how talented Cam Ward is and how much talent they have on this team, that most of the times they're not going to annihilate teams completely. They're not going to play up to that level of talent because of Mario Cristobal being their head coach. And we've seen 2 straight weeks now where Miami has played down the competition. You were a 10-point favorite going into this Cal game. You didn't cover. And you were nearly a 3-touchdown favorite when you were playing against Virginia Tech, and that game ended up being a dogfight. And both of these games, the common theme has been that the refs have kind of helped them out. And for Miami, I'm not going to say that the refs are the main reason why the Hurricanes are winning some of these games, because when you have a 35-10 lead, there's nobody who you can blame for losing that game outside of yourself. When you're up that big of a lead, you have to be able to seal the deal. If not, it's not because the refs helped out Miami. It's because you got too conservative, and that's what happened to Cal. Now, against Virginia Tech, I really don't know what to say about that play, because I understand the arguments on both sides. It's like it was initially ruled a touchdown, and normally when you rule something a touchdown on the field, it's hard to overturn it. But no matter what the rule book is, that play is just one of those calls that it's so many interpretations that you can make about it that it's really hard to judge if it was the right or the wrong call. But Miami has somewhat gotten some help from the refs, but it's not the main reason why they're winning. Why Miami is winning is because you got a superstar at quarterback in Cam Ward, and you got a resilient team that isn't going to quit. No matter how big of a lead Miami may have or how big of a deficit Miami may have to come back from behind, this is a team that is going to fight to the final whistle blows, and that's something that is a big catalyst for why Miami is still undefeated right now. When they get up big on teams, they still keep the pedal to the metal, and when they're down big, they still have the feeling that they can come back and win the game as long as Cam Ward is still standing upright and he's healthy. With Cam Ward, he has brought in the swagger, a different energy to Miami that this program hasn't had since the early 2000s. With Cam Ward, you feel Miami has a shot to win any game they play as long as he's able to stay healthy. And even if Cam Ward has a bad half of football, a bad 3 quarters, in the fourth quarter, he just seems to play his best football. He's unfazed. He always has a lot of confidence, no matter if he has 2 or 3 interceptions. He just has a dog mentality. He just has a certain swagger about him that makes Miami a hard team to beat. And even if they didn't have the refs on their side, I still believe Miami will still be an undefeated team because the opponents that they're playing aren't that good. Virginia Tech right now, like, they're a sub-500 team. They've disappointed up to this point this season. When you look at Cal, they beat Florida State, which is probably their best win of the season, and it wasn't really a convincing victory. You know, some of these teams, if Miami was playing a Clemson or something like that, if they were down 35-10 against Clemson, they probably get destroyed. They probably wouldn't come back in a game like that if they were down that big of a margin. But when you're going up against teams like Virginia Tech, Cal, these programs aren't accustomed to being in these kinds of situations where you got one of the best teams in college football on the ropes and you just got to deliver one final left hook to finish them off. Virginia Tech and Cal, it's not that they got screwed against the refs and that's why they lost Miami. It's that they don't know how to close out elite teams. You know, when they get a team like Miami on the ropes and they got a chance of pulling off a massive upset, you know what they do? They say, instead of trying to get aggressive and trying to win this game, let's try not to lose this game by giving up this big lead. And they get into this conservative mindset, and that's how Miami gets back into it. Because one thing that allows teams to get back into it that are heavy favorites when they're going up against an underdog is that the team that's the underdog that's up, you know, they feel like they got a lot to lose at that point. We got a top 5 team in college football on the ropes. Let's try to hold on to this thing. But when you got a school like Miami that's trying to maintain their ranking, they're trying to keep their storybook season going, and they're down so many possessions, they're playing with the mentality that we ain't got nothing to lose. We're finna take as many risks as possible. We're finna be super aggressive until we find a way to get back into this thing. And that's why schools like Cal and Virginia Tech have not been able to beat the Canes this year. Because Miami, when their back is against the wall, they get into an attack mentality where we got to be aggressive. We got to be able to come out and have a different level of intensity that we didn't have in the first half. Now that we're trailing, we have to do more in order to win. And the schools that they're going up against, they have a completely different mentality. When you go against a desperate team that's down, they got nothing to lose. Meanwhile, when you're up so much, you feel like you got everything to lose. It's like that old model that goes, desperate men do desperate things. The most dangerous person in the world is somebody who's desperate, somebody who feels like they don't have anything to lose. And the same thing goes when it comes to college football. When you got a team that's down by so many possessions and they're in risk of having their first loss of the season, they get in that desperation mindset where we just got to do whatever it takes to win. We got to do whatever it takes to make a play to get this game back in our favor on our side, momentum-wise. But schools like Cal, they don't have that same level of desperation. Instead, they become lackadaisical, conservative because they don't want to blow the opportunity. Why Vanderbilt was able to beat Alabama is because they were aggressive. They were willing to take risks. They were willing to roll the dice even though they had the lead, because they knew that Alabama was going to have that same level of aggressiveness, so they would be dumb not to have that same level of aggressiveness on their side. That's what it takes to beat a great team. When you have a team like Miami on the ropes, you can't get conservative. You got to take extra risk. You maybe have to send extra pressure. You got to do things that you aren't accustomed to doing that make you uncomfortable, because that's what it takes to beat an elite team in college football. You got to do things that make you uncomfortable. You got to do things that are a little bit outside the norm. And that's what Cal and Virginia Tech were unable to do, and that's why they lost to Miami. It's not that the refs are saving Miami in these games. It's just that these teams don't have the ability to close out great teams, and that's why they are where they are. Cal isn't going anywhere this year, but maybe a 7-win season, and Virginia Tech, they're going to be a massive disappointment considering all the hype that they had coming into this season. They probably are going to go 6-6. Meanwhile, you got a team like Vanderbilt that looks like they could be an 8, maybe 9-win team this year because they have a different mentality when they got a certain team on the ropes that's way better than them, that's ranked higher than them. They have this mentality that we're going to match their aggressiveness. We're going to take just as many risks as what they're going to take because we're not trying to lose this game. We're trying to win this game, and we're going to outright prove that we are the better team. And Cal, Virginia Tech, they never really looked like the better team than what Miami was. It's just that they got fortunate that Miami wasn't playing their best football. They were able to take advantage of it. Vandy outcoached, outplayed, out everything out of Alabama. Cal didn't really outplay Miami. Miami was able to cakewalk through the first 3 quarters, and then once they got down by so much, that's when they flipped that switch and they said, okay, we need to wake up. Now we need to start playing ball. It's like if you ever played Madden with one of your homies and you're down 17-0, you end up, kind of scooting up a little bit. You get closer to the TV, and now you start locking in. That's what Miami did against Cal and Virginia Tech. When they got down, they started locking in, and those teams, they started getting conservative. And Miami really put themselves in the hole in those games. It's not like Cal and Virginia Tech were just better than them. Miami was beating themselves with the Cam Ward interceptions, the mistakes, just the self-imposed errors is what got Miami in those situations to begin with where they had to come from behind. And you can say that the refs probably saved them against VT and Cal, but like my old high school coach used to tell me, if you don't want the refs to dictate the outcome of these games, don't allow yourself to be in a position where the refs have the final say in determining if you win or lose the game with certain calls. Some of y'all ain't going to like that, but that's just reality of football. If you don't want the zebras to dictate how the game goes, don't allow the game to be able to be dictated by them because you put yourself in a position to win just for outright playing some great football. When you allow the refs to dictate some of these outcomes in these close games, you end up ultimately feeling like you got screwed. If you don't want these situations to happen, then just blow our team out. Cal was up 35-10. What was the reason for why they weren't able to win that game 52-10? It wasn't the refs. It's not like the refs were calling all kinds of penalties that helped Miami just get back into the lead. Like, I feel like people love saying that football is rigged as a coping mechanism because they can't accept what the outcome was when football is not rigged. Some of y'all, I think, just are a little bit slow when it comes to this, but Vegas makes money regardless of who wins and who loses. Vegas never really loses. There may be weeks when people are betting heavy on a certain team, and Vegas may take a big hit from that, but there are plenty other ways that Vegas gets that money back. Vegas doesn't lose all their earnings off one game. I think the stupidest shit that people say is football is rigged. You can't rig a football game. You can't stage a football game. Football is real. This isn't WWE, people, where they're scripting out, okay, in the third quarter with 3 seconds left, you got to fumble the football. Like, you can't script out a football game. And nobody is going to take a ransom to flat out throw a football game. And even if one dude on the team is trying to throw a game, it's going to be blatantly obvious, and the coach is going to do something about it. Like, people are getting paid $2-4 million a year to coach this game of football. People's jobs, livelihoods are on the line with this sport. Nobody's about to allow Vegas to jeopardize their living all over a couple of million to rig a game. Like, that's some of the most retarded logic that I hear out of fans when they can't accept the outcome of a game. These are refs. These are humans. They're going to make mistakes. The only way you're going to fix the bad officiating is if you replace them with AI machines. When you have humans that are making decisions that comes down to personal perception, and a lot of these rules, a lot of these calls don't have a definitive answer, it's like, The Dez Bryant catch with the Cowboys and the Packers in the playoffs a few years ago. You know, nobody knows what a catch is ever since that play, because a lot of these calls are judgment calls. And a lot of the things that don't get called, the refs don't see it because the speed of the game is so fast. And it has nothing to do with refs being part-time, they're not being full-time. People believe if we had full-time officials, we would have less bad calls, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The point is that the officiating is always going to be terrible because we're humans, we can't see everything, and we're going to make some mistakes when it comes to certain judgment calls, especially when you get ridiculous plays like what you got in the end of VT versus Miami. We never seen something like that before. Let's move on. Michigan got their second loss of the season, getting upset on the road by the Huskies. 27-17 was the final in Washington. And the main reason why Michigan lost that game is because their offense was completely broken. The only thing they could do was run the football. If Michigan isn't allowed to spam the run game for the entirety of a game, they get in trouble because they don't have the ability to play complementary football. What made the past 3 years of Michigan football one of the most dominant stretches in program history for the Wolverines was that they had the ability to run a balanced offense. They could kill you running the football, but they also could kill you in the pass game as well. And you had a really good quarterback in J.J. McCarthy, who let Jim Harbaugh tell it he's the best Michigan quarterback ever from a talent standpoint when it came to his ability to make big plays with the game on the line. You don't have that this year with the three quarterbacks that you've thrown out there. Tuttle, he's not that good. Alex Orji's only a good athlete. He's more of an athlete than he is a quarterback. And then Davis Warren just doesn't know how to minimize bad decisions. So when you got bad quarterback play, you got a bad offense, because you can only go so far in today's age of college football if you don't have a quarterback that you can trust. Eventually, you're going to be put in situations like you were against Washington where the run game isn't working. You got to be able to generate some plays in the passing game, and Michigan can't do it. Now, I thought that Michigan was just so dominant up front that they could just run over anybody they played until they went up against Ohio State. But what I kind of overlooked is that sometimes you're just going to have teams that are just better than others at stopping the run. And when you have a team that goes all out on stopping the run and you can't pose a threat throwing it, you don't give the defense anything to be worried about, because they already know what you're going to do before you do it. It's a difference between being able to run the football when the team knows you want to run, and it's a difference between wanting to run the football, the team knows you want to do it, and they're able to stop it. Now, Michigan still was able to get some big runs, like Donovan Edwards had a big explosive touchdown during that loss. But the thing is that you can't win games in college football every single week by just spamming 55 runs every single week. That's not a strategy that results in winning football. You got to be balanced. You got to be able to make the defense somewhat fear that you're going to throw it so they don't know what's coming. And when you play Michigan, you already know what they're going to do. They're just going to spam the run every single game, and there's nothing else that you really have to game plan for, because your quarterback position is in disarray, and you also lack any dynamic playmakers in the passing game at receiver. Your only reliable receiver is Colson Loveland, and he's a tight end. And the problem that also has hurt Michigan's offense isn't just that they don't have good quarterback play, but for the very longest, even when Jim Harbaugh was the head coach, they've never really been that great at developing good receivers. Look at how well Nico Collins is playing for the Houston Texans. He never played this good when he was at Houston. Well, when he was at Michigan. You know, it's one of the biggest mysteries ever. Like, when Nico Collins was playing for Michigan, he was one of those players that you see as kind of wasted potential, because he had all this hype coming out of high school, and he got to Michigan and he never really quite played up to his level of potential. But he gets to the NFL and all of a sudden he's living up to that potential. Why is that? It has to be the coaching and the player development. When you think of Michigan, you think of a program that develops monsters up front, great offensive linemen, great defensive linemen, great running backs. You don't think of a team, a program that has a rich history of developing great receivers. And it's not just a Michigan problem, but it's also a Big Ten problem. Outside of Ohio State and Oregon, there aren't too many teams in this conference that have dynamic wide receivers, that have a dynamic passing attack. You feel me? So for Michigan moving forward, Sharon Moore, what he has to change with this program is their inability to develop dynamic playmakers on the perimeter. That is the biggest thing that Michigan is lacking. You got everything. You got great trench play. You got really good DBs, but offensively, you don't have the good quarterbacks, and you don't have the necessary talent around them to throw the football to that could elevate a guy like a Davis Warren or an Alex Orji. That year that Georgia won the championship with Stetson Bennett, Kirby Smart's first ever title, they had an all-star team around Stetson Bennett. Good receivers, a great offensive line, great running backs. They just weren't a one-trick pony where they were just spamming the run a million times a game. And year two, when they went back-to-back with Stetson, they were able to replicate that formula because of how good Brock Bowers was. They had Lad McConkey. Georgia has shown the ability to develop great playmakers at receiver. Michigan hasn't been able to do that. And they also haven't really been able to develop a high-end quarterback. J.J. McCarthy is the most talented quarterback that Michigan has probably ever had. I remember a lot of years watching Michigan football under Jim Harbaugh before they had their recent string of success when they had Shea Patterson at quarterback. You know, a guy like Shea Patterson was okay, but he was never going to be able to take your offense to the next level. Michigan is one of those programs that they can develop a lot of possessions well outside of receivers and quarterbacks, and that's why their offenses are normally dependent on how successfully they can establish the run game. And when they can't do that, you force them to become one-dimensional throwing the football. You expose their biggest weakness, their inability to recruit and develop high-end talent on the outside. And that's the biggest problem with Michigan football that Sharon Moore has to correct. I don't believe that Sharon Moore was a terrible hire by Michigan. I believe that, you know, they made the right decision. You weren't going to have a lot of time to do an extended coaching search anyway, just with how late you were into the off season. You already had National Signing Day. You want to have a coach that recruits are already familiar with, so you don't get a bunch of decommitments and a bunch of, you know, transfers. And with Sharon Moore, you were still able to sustain that culture that was built under Jim Harbaugh. But he is going to have to take this program for what it was under Jim Harbaugh and find a way to make it better. And the way to do that is by getting better at finding better wide receivers, being able to properly develop them, and getting better quarterback play. If you got to go spend $2-3 million to get a good quarterback, it's not a bad investment, because although football is a team sport, the most impactful position when it comes to winning and losing games is the QB position. And if you had a really good quarterback this year, like if you were able to get your hands on the Cam Ward, you probably would be undefeated right now. But that's why Michigan's offense is broken, because they don't develop high-end wide receivers. They can't consistently develop high-level quarterbacks neither. They just are a quarterback that has this old-school mentality that we're going to develop really good offensive and defensive linemen. We're going to have a stout defense. We're going to be tough up front. We're going to spam the run game until you prove you can't stop it. But then when there is a team that they go up against that can stop the run game, that can match their physicality, they get in trouble. Remember when they got blown out by Georgia and the semifinals a few years ago? They couldn't run the football because Georgia matched Michigan's physicality. And what was Michigan's counterpunch? They didn't have one. Michigan's offense is broken because they don't have a counterpunch. They're just a school that's overly dependent on their right hook. And when they can't knock you out with that right hook and you force them to have another game plan, they can't win. because they don't know any way else but knocking you out with just that right hook. They keep using it until it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, they have nothing else in their bag that they can use to find the way to win. And that's why Michigan's offense is struggling right now. They're a one-trick pony. And until they can diversify this offense, they're going to continue to struggle. And Sharon Moore right now, he's currently dealing with an identity crisis. And this isn't the first time that Michigan has gone through this. What a lot of people forget about the Jim Harbaugh era, I know the last 4 years of Michigan football made people forget about some of the struggles that Jim Harbaugh had for the majority of his tenure down in Ann Arbor, but he made a lot of changes offensively. He went from a pro-style offense to a spread offense, back to a pro-style offense, because he was trying to figure out what works. Michigan has to do a better job at fixing their issues with their inability to play complementary football, stemming from their quarterback problems and how bad they are at developing wide receivers to reach their potential. Before we move on to the NFL segment of this live, I want to shout out everybody that's tuned in. Shout out Unruly TV. Shout out Shadow Band. Shout out Vocal Mike. Shout out Ashley White. They say, what do you think about Kalen DeBoer's response to Alabama losing? Is his calmness a positive thing or something to be concerned about? I believe Kalen DeBoer's calmness is a plus, man. Like, not everybody has to be super intense like Nick Saban to win. Nick Saban, as good as a coach as what he was, you know, you don't always have to be what Nick Saban was in order to win. It's okay to have your own identity. And I think it's kind of refreshing that you don't have a head coach that's as intense as what Saban is. And it's not like if you're not a Bill Belichick or a Nick Saban, you can't win. You know, you just have to run your program in the best way to help your team succeed. And I think Kalen DeBoer is doing that. Of course, you're going to have a few losses along the way that are going to have to force you to have to recalibrate and modify some things. But I still believe that Kalen DeBoer is the best man for the job down there in Tuscaloosa. The Carolina Panthers got thrashed by the Chicago Bears. It was a blowout, and it was probably the worst game that the Panthers have had since Andy Dalton took over as the starting quarterback. And of course, with Andy Dalton struggling in this game against a really good Chicago Bears defense, they put Bryce Young out there in garbage time. And of course, he looked good when Chicago was pretty much running nothing but a prevent defense. And now people want to say, all right, we got to go back to Bryce Young. That's going to fix everything in Carolina. Here's the brutal reality about the 2024 Carolina Panthers. And if you're a Panthers fan, you got to listen closely to this. You were never going to be a good team coming into this season. The Panthers, no matter how good the quarterback play was this year, you were never going to be anything more than a 7-win team at best. All right? This team coming into the year had one of the worst rosters, if not the worst roster in the NFL. Think about all of the talent that Carolina lost on the defensive side of the football. Frankie Louisville, who was the heart and soul on that defense for the last couple of years, he's now in Washington. You lost Gross Matos. You lost a lot of depth on defense, a lot of talent in the back end of that secondary. Jeremy Chin, he's now gone. You trade away Dante Jackson. And offensively, you are already lacking a lot of firepower as it is coming into this year. And although your receiving core is improved, you improve your offensive line, you still have a lot of holes on both sides of the football. So Carolina was never going to be a playoff team, and I overhyped this team. I'm going to be honest, I got a little bit too excited about Bryce Young going into his sophomore season. It turns out the dude is just a flat-out bust and he can't play, and you know, this team had more holes than what I thought they did. Like, regardless of how good of a defensive coordinator Jaro Evero is, he has probably the worst defense in the NFL when it comes to pure talent. Like, the Carolina Panthers are just a trash team. And I'm not saying that to be disrespectful. I'm trying to say that as nice as humanly possible because I love Carolina Panthers fans. I'm not trying to just crap on y'all just to crap on y'all because y'all not good. What I'm trying to say is that if you thought this team was going to be able to play better than what they have early to start this season, you are a little bit delusional. And I was right there with you. Before the season, I said that I trusted the Panthers to win this division more than I did the Atlanta Falcons. Do you not know how foolish I look now when I think upon that statement? Like, the Atlanta Falcons just have a way more talented team than what Carolina has. This is a rebuilding season for the Carolina Panthers. And you already messed up when you whiffed on drafting Bryce Young first overall. When you miss on quarterbacks in the draft, it normally sets your franchise back 3-4 years. It's going to take a while for the Carolina Panthers to put a team on the field that's playoff caliber. Right now, this is still a bottom 3 roster in the NFL. They really don't have any key pieces on defense, especially with the injuries that they sustained. Derrick Brown, your best player on the defense side of the football, he's out for the season. You just lost another guy to an injury. Austin Corbett on the offensive line. Like, the Carolina Panthers, they already were coming into this season not that talented. Then you throw injuries on top of it. This was a recipe for another bad season for Carolina. And if you're a Panthers fan, the thing with having Andy Dalton in at quarterback is now that he makes you somewhat competitive. Although you still are going to lose with him in the majority of games that you play this year, it's not going to be 45-7, 45-3 like what we saw in the first 2 games when you had Bryce Young in that quarterback. But the games are still going to be lost by a pretty big margin just because you aren't that talented. And as good as a coach as Dave Canales could turn into, you know, there's only so much coaching can do when you just have holes all across the board on your roster. The Panthers are just not a good team. Even if you go back to Bryce Young, that's not going to make you better. You're still going to have the same issues. Eventually, you got to just accept the fact that we aren't that good of a team. You know, having Andy Dalton in makes you somewhat watchable. If you're going to be bad, you rather be bad with Andy Dalton because nobody wants to tune in and watch their team just get annihilated week after week, 45-3, like what you were with Bryce Young. Like, Bryce Young is not the answer. You're better off just trading him, trying to get anything that you can draft-wise for him because there's nothing there with Bryce Young. Andy Dalton, and every game that he has started so far for the Panthers, even dating back to last season, the Panthers have done more offensively than what they've ever done with Bryce Young. Like, Bryce Young played good against backups in garbage time. The Chicago Bears had their second string defense in, and they were pretty much in a prevent defense. So Bryce Young was able to destroy them underneath. But that was garbage time. We saw what Bryce Young has done. And the few games that he's played this season, he's made the Panthers unwatchable. He had guys frustrated. He had Adam Thielen frustrated. Deontay Johnson now looks like a very good wide receiver with Andy Dalton in that quarterback. Like, the Panthers just are a crappy team. You know, it has nothing to do with the quarterback play. Andy Dalton gives you the best chance to win games, but if you're trying to tank and get the first overall pick, then Bryce Young gives you the best chance to do that because you're not going to be remotely competitive as what you are with Andy Dalton at quarterback than what you are with Bryce Young. Bryce Young guarantees that you're going to lose by 20 or more every single game. At least when you got Andy Dalton in, you can have a respectable loss to the Cincinnati Bengals. You know, you're still losing by more than 10, but at least it's respectable. At least you show some fight. With Bryce Young, you could even get past the 50 with him in. It's tough to hear this if you're a Panthers fan that your team just flat out sucks because you're devoid of talent, but that's the truth of the matter. You know, you're down some of your best players on the team out for the season, and you already didn't have that much talent anyway with everything that you lost in free agency. This was always going to be a down season for the Carolina Panthers. And that's just the brutal reality that this Chicago Bears loss made me realize when I was watching the Panthers. The Cleveland Browns season is in jeopardy of, let me rephrase that. The Cleveland Browns right now, they're 1-4, and there's a really good chance that they don't make it to the playoffs as long as they continue to roll with Deshaun Watson as their starting quarterback. Deshaun, he just doesn't have it anymore. He's never going to revert back to the same player that we saw playing for the Texans when he was an MVP candidate. And the Browns, they got scammed for $230 million fully guaranteed. And at this point, you just need to take your loss, take it on the chin, accept the fact that Deshaun Watson is never going to be good again, and bench him in favor of Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston isn't the best quarterback in the world, but he's good enough where with the team that you have around him, you could turn your season around and still make it to the playoffs. Last season, you went to the postseason with old man Joe Flacco coming off the couch. If you can make it to the postseason with Joe Flacco, you can definitely make it with Jameis Winston. The thing with Jameis Winston is that as aggressive as what he is and as many mistakes as he tends to make, he can make up for him the following drive with touchdowns. And with you having a good group of wide receivers, you got Judy, you got Amari Cooper for the time being, you got Njoku, you got Jerome Ford, and your offensive line, as bad as what they've played, a lot of those sacks that Deshaun Watson is taking is because he's not getting the football out fast enough, or he just blatantly is running directly into sacks. And it's good to see that Deshaun has a little bit of that elite mobility still from his Houston days, but he's not really utilizing it correctly. You know, anytime Deshaun Watson is extending plays and he's not getting outside the pocket, when he's running around within the pocket, the dude just runs into pressure. He runs directly into sacks. Like a couple of those sacks that Deshaun Watson took against the Washington Commanders were on him, at least 3 or 4 of them, because the dude just doesn't have good pocket presence. And he never has been known as a quarterback that can beat you from within the pocket. A lot of his game has always been, you know, making things happen off script. With Jameis Winston, he's a better pocket quarterback than what Deshaun Watson is, because mobility is not really a big part of Jameis Winston's game. Jameis Winston, with the team that the Browns have right now, you insert him into the starting lineup, and there's a good chance that you probably could be a 9, maybe 10 win team at the end of the season, because Jameis Winston is a better quarterback than what Deshaun Watson is right now. As tough as that is to hear if you're a Browns fan, it's the truth. But the reason why you refuse to start the better quarterback is because you got so much tied up to Deshaun Watson financially that you got to make sure that you get everything that you paid for out of Deshaun Watson, and that you get the value that you gave up when you got Deshaun Watson out of him. And that's not going to happen. And if the Browns are seriously committed to winning this season, they should stop doing all this politicking and start the better quarterback. Deshaun Watson, we've seen enough of this dude in the Browns uniform to know that he sucks now. He's one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL. Do you know how crazy it is that Daniel Dimes has played better than Deshaun Watson, and the Giants aren't even that better than what the Cleveland Browns are? You can blame the defense all you want to, but what the hell do you want the defense to do when they got to carry a team that has a non-existent offense with a quarterback that nobody really seems to be inspired by? When you hear Jameis Winston talk to those teammates, they listen, they perk their ears up. Jameis Winston is one of those dudes that people love to play with. He brings an infectious energy that makes him super likable, that you want to give your all to him. But with Deshaun Watson, with the off-the-field issues that he has going on, the never-ending sexual assault allegations that he always has coming out against him, it just seems like it's hard for him to mentally be there anymore. And maybe that's the reason why his play has fallen off so badly over these last couple of years, because when the Browns traded for Deshaun Watson, they thought that they finally found the missing piece to them not being able to make it to the Super Bowl. And instead, you trade away Baker Mayfield and you dug yourself in a bigger hole when it comes to the quarterback position. There were some people saying that when Jacoby Brissett had to start for Deshaun Watson, Deshaun never should have played that season because Jacoby Brissett was better based off the system that Kevin Stefanski has built around Deshaun Watson. The problem isn't Stefanski. Stefanski is the best coach that the Browns have had in 2 decades. You weren't going nowhere until you hired Kevin Stefanski. If anything, you should give Kevin Stefanski a lifelong contract because your franchise has a great history of hiring awful coaches. So the fact that the Browns were able to hire Kevin Stefanski and he's given them the most success that they've had since 2002 shows you that Kevin Stefanski isn't the problem. It's the quarterback that he has that's the problem, because he's forced to make it work with the quarterback that just isn't a starting caliber quarterback anymore in today's NFL. Jameis Winston, if you start him right now, you immediately have a great chance to turn your season around. You make your offense more explosive because you got a quarterback that can generate more plays in the vertical passing game, just because we know that Jameis Winston has a really good arm. He's a really accurate downfield thrower. It's just that sometimes he just doesn't have good decision making, and that can get him into a bind at times. But if you're the Cleveland Browns, you take Jameis Winston throwing 4 touchdowns and 3 interceptions, and you put 20, 24 on the board because you got a good enough defense that can bail you out when Jameis Winston makes mistakes. You know, the problem is that Deshaun Watson is holding back the Cleveland Browns, and they refuse to do anything about it. They refuse to allow this man to stink up the rest of the organization. It's pretty clear that his teammates don't really have a lot of respect for him. You know, look at the way the offensive line blocks for him. When he's scolding at guys, like, guys aren't receptive to it. When guys are getting yelled at by Deshaun Watson, they're looking at the dude like, bro, like, the hell are you yelling at me for? But when Jameis Winston was yelling at that same offensive lineman that Deshaun was yelling at, and their loss to the Raiders, you know, the dude was a little bit more receptive to it. But when Deshaun Watson's yelling at you, it's like, bro, like, who are you to yell at me? Like, you're not good. You're not part of the solution. You're part of the problem. You know, like, Deshaun Watson, it's just, I don't get how the Browns can continue to just allow this dude to put up dud after dud and still continue to start him and say that he gives them the best chance to win over Jameis Winston. At this point, you are better off keeping Tyler Huntley. Tyler Huntley, you can make the argument that he's no worse than Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson is probably the worst quarterback in the NFL right now. And the only quarterback who you can say has been just as bad, if not worse than Deshaun, is probably Jacoby Brissett or Trevor Lawrence. And even Trevor Lawrence has played some pretty good football over these last couple of weeks. But it's time to bench Deshaun Watson and start Jameis Winston if the Browns are serious about trying to win this year. So the Pittsburgh Steelers lost to the Dallas Cowboys on Sunday Night Football. This is their second straight loss, and I got some big takeaways from this game. And let's start off with the quarterback position. The big question is it time for the Steelers to bench Justin Fields? Is it time to let Russ cook? Because Justin Fields in the first half against Dallas, he didn't play that good, only completed 4 passes in the first half. And then the second half, after he got knocked out of the game and sent to the blue medical tent, once he came back in, he was playing some really good football. He threw 2 touchdown passes, and he put the Steelers in position to win the game. He gave them the lead. That's the best you could ask for out of your quarterback. Just give us a chance to win, which is what Justin Fields did. It was on the defense to win that game, and they didn't come through. You had Mike Tomlin, who burnt the timeout and an unnecessary situation. It's like, you got to save that timeout just in case they end up scoring, so you can at least give your offense 1 timeout to work with. So the clock management wasn't really that great out of Mike Tomlin. And the offense, everybody wants to put all the blame on Justin Fields when he really has been carrying this offense, because Mike Tomlin, coming into this year, he wanted this team to be a run-first operation. And when you got a running back in Najee Harris that's only averaging 3.3 yards per carry and still is yet to score a touchdown, he's part of the problem to why this offense stinks. Najee Harris is not a good running back. He's a solid running back. He's an average running back, but he's not what you expect out of a running back that you draft in the first round. When you draft the first round running back, you need somebody that has elite explosiveness. When you watch Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, those guys have a different gear. They got more acceleration, more burst than what Najee Harris does. When you watch those 3 backs play, you see why they were first round picks. You don't see that when you watch Najee Harris. When you see Najee Harris, you see a dude that's a tough, old school running back, but he doesn't have the ability to break off big chunks of yardage. He doesn't really have a lot of yards of 20 plus or more. And he's not really that effective in short yardage situation, despite his size. And why he was so highly talked about coming out of Alabama is because of how well he could catch the football out of the backfield. And we haven't really seen too much of that neither. Like, this offense is held back not because of Justin Fields per se. Like, Justin Fields, he is capable of playing some better football. And even if you start Russell Wilson, there's no guarantee that the Steelers' offense is going to improve because the offensive line is down several starters, and you also don't have enough playmakers around whoever you're going to have at quarterback. Like, your only dependable wide receiver is George Pickens, and he's getting double teamed, quadruple teamed, because nobody else respects the other weapons in the passing game that the Steelers have. As much as I love Calvin Austin, the dude is not one of those dudes who should be starting for you as an outside receiver. You know, if you got to start Calvin Austin, it's because you have an injury. He's not somebody that's going to give you consistent wide receiver play. Van Jefferson is no better than a wide receiver 4 or 5 at best. This is who Justin Fields and Russell Wilson are throwing the football to this year. Even when Roman Wilson comes back and he gets fully healthy, he might not be too much of a difference maker. This is an offense that right now is suffering from not having a great personnel offensively. The running back position isn't that good. Najee, there's an obvious reason why the Steelers declined his 5th-year option, because he's not what you expect when you invest a first-round pick into a running back. You got a depleted offensive line, and you only got one receiver that is consistent at making plays. So it doesn't matter who you start at quarterback because nothing is going to change. Justin Fields gives you the best chance to win because with you not having a lot of dynamic playmakers, you need somebody who can buy time for guys to get open, somebody who can evade pressure and make all-platform throws. And Justin Fields has also carried the Steelers on the ground. You know, he's accounted for every touchdown that the Steelers have scored this year, a certain capacity. Rather, he ran it on the ground for himself and ran it in, or if he's throwing touchdowns as well. Every touchdown the Steelers have scored has been because of Justin Fields. And if you start Russell Wilson, you know, your passing game probably won't be all that better because who is this dude throwing to? You know, Justin Fields has not been that bad. He can play a lot better. That Cowboys game is probably the worst that he's played this year, but, you know, he's still giving the Steelers better quarterback than what they've had in the past. If the Steelers would have kept Deontay Johnson, they would have been in a much better position offensively than what they are right now currently. This is just the offense that doesn't have enough firepower to score 20 plus consistently on the scoreboard. And defensively, you know, when you got a defensive-minded coach and your defense is on the field and they got the opportunity to seal the win for you, that's a situation where if you're Mike Tomlin, you're salivating over, because I trust my defense more being a defensive-minded guy than I do my offense, because this is my level of expertise. This is where I specialize at, right? And to allow the Dallas Cowboys, you know, to get that game-winning touchdown, which is downright disgusting to me, because if you're going to burn the timeout in that situation, you should have your defense prepared. After a timeout that you didn't have to use and you're not going to allow your offense to have, you should have had the best game plan possible to not allow Dallas to get that game-winning touchdown to Jalen Tolbert. You feel me? Like, when I'm looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers defensively, I'm looking at a defense that's doing all they can to carry a team that has a really walky offense. But in a situation like that, you got to get it done. And you can't do anything but point the finger at Mike Tomlin. You know, because in that situation, you use a timeout, you should have everything down packed. You know, there shouldn't be a touchdown scored in that situation if you're going to take away a timeout from the offense. You know, like, as good as a coach as what Mike Tomlin is, he's handicapping himself with certain situations that he has put himself in, not going out there getting a true franchise quarterback. I don't feel like Justin Fields and Russell Wilson are the long-term solutions. I never viewed any one of them as a long-term solution at QB for the Steelers. I've always viewed them as just a one-year rental, both of them, because I don't view neither one as the long-term answer for Pittsburgh. The long-term answer for Pittsburgh at quarterback is by drafting one in next year's draft, whether that be Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders, Jalen Milroe. The Steelers got to draft the quarterback, or they got to pick up a quality one in free agency. But ever since Big Ben retired, the Steelers have just been getting band-aids at the QB position because they don't know how to evaluate that position properly. You know, even if Russ comes in, I still don't expect anything to change because the play calling is still very vanilla. Arthur Smith, he's doing a pretty good job with Justin Fields, but the passing game hasn't really been that explosive. He's not allowing Justin Fields to throw the football downfield as much. And I still feel like there's better ways that Justin Fields can be utilized. But if you start Russell Wilson, you kind of handicap Arthur Smith as far as his play calling goes because there's a lot that Justin Fields can do that Russell Wilson simply can't. So the main problems that I see with the Steelers offensively have been here for the last couple of years. The offensive line ain't that good. Najee Harris ain't giving you anything on the ground. 3.3 yards per carry is really disgusting for a first-round running back. And Justin Fields, you can criticize his play, and you have lost 2 straight. If you lose 3 straight, then I wouldn't be against making a quarterback change, but nothing is still going to change because the fundamental issue with this offense is that you just don't have enough playmakers, you know, and your offensive line isn't healthy. And until those areas change, you know, there's nothing that a quarterback change is going to do to really help you because you don't have 2 quarterbacks that can elevate the team around them. They're only going to be as good as what they have to throw to. Now, if you have a Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow or Lamar, then we will be having a different conversation. The last thing I want to talk about before I get up on out of here is this. So the Buffalo Bills have now lost 2 straight in a row. They lost to Baltimore last week. They just lost to the Houston Texans. And the 2 major issues that are hurting the Buffalo Bills this season is that, for one, you ain't got no consistency at wide receiver. So Khalil Shakir, he ended up missing that game against the Houston Texans on Sunday due to an ankle injury, and he's pretty much been their only reliable wide receiver. Like, anytime you watch a Bills game, the first guy Josh Allen is always looking to throw the ball to is Khalil Shakir. And without him on the field, this offense, as far as still weapons, they don't have any. Like, Dalton Kincaid, he's been inconsistent this year. He's dropped a few passes. Keon Coleman, he's still growing into his role with the Buffalo Bills, and the Bills really don't know how to use Keon Coleman. Keon Coleman is a really good deep threat. He's not one of those receivers that you can look as a possession guy that can keep the trains moving for you, keep the drive alive. He's one of those big play wideouts. And Curtis Samuel, they just don't have a role for him at all. So you got an offense right now that is really missing how good Stephon Diggs was as their number 1 wide receiver. And you definitely can make a legitimate argument that if anybody needs to trade for DeVante Adams, they are the team that needs him the most, because if you get DeVante Adams, it would change up a lot for Buffalo offensively, because you've shown the ability to run the football. You can play complementary football, but when you're going up against some of the better teams in the NFL that can take away what you do best, then you're going to be handicapped in a lot of these games because you got arguably the worst receiving core in the NFL. And until the Buffalo Bills can get more consistency at wideout, you're going to continue to come up short when you go up against some of the best teams in the NFL, because it's going to be hard to run for over 100 yards against the Baltimore Ravens or the Houston Texans with how well coached their defense are. Imagine what's going to happen when you got to play the New York Jets this week. They got a really good defense, and with you not really having any elite players on the perimeter, it's going to put you in the box. And there's only so much a dude like Josh Allen can do. As gifted as what he is, Like, the dude can't do anything when you just give him nothing to work with that wide receiver. Like, a lot of these dudes aren't even playing above average right now. And another big issue that is killing the Buffalo Bills is that they have just been derailed with a bevy of injuries on the defensive side of the football. Like, you got Ed Oliver, he was out against the Texans. Matt Milano, he's out. Taylor Rapp, he's out too. Von Miller, he's suspended for 4 games. So with all the injuries that the Bills have, it's pretty reasonable to expect this defense to play the way that they've had, despite Sean McDermott being a defensive-minded coach, because even some of the backups that he has in, like Terrell Bernard, they're getting banged up. And at this point, you're out there throwing third stringers, practice squad guys on the field. It's kind of what we're seeing out of the Bills defense. And with them having an opportunity, getting back into that game against the Houston Texans, but falling short of being able to complete the comeback, the biggest reason why they couldn't win that game is just because, you didn't have any weapon on offense that you can go through to give you some instant offense. Once Houston was able to box up that run game, they were able to shut down Josh Allen. It was pretty much game over. And you know that Josh Allen, he's going to have a few plays that he makes when he just makes a crazy throw outside the pocket, but the Ravens and the Texans did a really good job of keeping him from making those kinds of game-changing plays. They kept him within the pocket, forced him to have to get the ball out to these wide receivers, and these receivers were unable to get separation. Like, a lot of the teams that Buffalo has played this year, like the Ravens and the Texans, they're doing nothing but playing man coverage across the board against them. And when you got a team that plays straight man against you, it shows that they got no respect for your wide receivers. They don't respect your receivers to get off the line to be able to consistently separate. So until the Buffalo Bills can get better receiving play or they trade for a playmaker on the outside, their offense is going to struggle with how tough their schedule is about to be over the next couple of weeks. And they will get healthy on defense, but their offensive struggle still might not change a lot. So this is it for this episode of JT Sports Live. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Shout out to Unruly TV. Shout out to Chris Brady. Shout out to Vocal Mike. Chris Brady says, something you don't see every day, Oregon +4 at home. He also says Washington +3 at Iowa. Betting line is already starting to move towards Washington. Yeah, I love Washington +3 against Iowa. I'm always going to fade a team that has no offense. Oregon, I like them at home. I'll probably jump on that one too because, man, it's tough to win on the road in college football. We've seen Georgia come up short on the road against Alabama, and Ohio State going on the road against Oregon. I'm a little bit 50-50 about that one because the thing about Oregon is that I don't really think they've looked that good offensively. And I do think defensively, Ohio State is going to give their offense a lot of problems, but we'll see. But I appreciate everybody for tuning in for this episode. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Remember, we are not just a YouTube channel. We are a podcast. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts from. The JT Sports Podcast is available. Give us a 5-star review and share if you enjoy. Follow us on Instagram at JT Sports _ and on X at JT Sports __. And I will see you guys shortly.